Hello everyone, today I want to talk to you about how you can do anything, just never work yourself to the point of losing yourself. The most beautiful general is now in Russia, and now she's going to work as a factory worker. Also, Trump bombed Iran, what exactly is he afraid of? The US military launched the airstrike with 125 fighter jets, and they're even playing tricks to distract the enemy. Details of the US attack on Iran's nuclear facilities have been released, and we can see it was a very cautious, or perhaps very timid, strike. Logically, as a global military superpower, the US attacking a country with such weak air defenses shouldn't look like this. On June 22, US Secretary of Defense Hegses and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Feint held a press conference together to explain the details of the US military strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. The code name for this US operation was Midnight Hammer. Feint explained that the total number of US aircraft involved in this operation exceeded 125, including B-2 bombers, aerial refueling planes, reconnaissance aircraft, and fighter jets. This unprecedented operation deployed 7 B-2 stealth bombers. According to the timeline released by Feint, at midnight Eastern Time on Friday, June 20th, a group of US B-2 bombers took off from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. The main force, consisting of 7 B-2s, headed east across the Pacific Ocean. During the more than 10-hour-long flight, they maintained only the minimum necessary communications, doing their best to reduce the chance of being detected. Notably, during this period, the US military also carried out a deception operation, sending several other B-2 bombers into the Pacific as decoys to confuse and distract outsiders, drawing attention away from the main force. At around 5 p.m. on Saturday, the 21st, Eastern Time in the United States, a U.S. military submarine launched more than 20 Tomahawk cruise missiles at Iran's Isfahan nuclear facility, targeting this above-ground nuclear site. This was the first wave of strikes. But at 6:40, the lead B-2 bomber dropped 2 PB-57 massive bunker buster bombs on the main Fordow nuclear facility, while the other aircraft bombed their respective targets. Feint said that these bombers dropped more than 12 massive bunker buster bombs, each weighing 30,000 pounds, on Iran's Fordow and Natanz nuclear facilities. The entire bombing lasted from 6:40 to 7:05, which is about 25 minutes in total. This was the longest mission carried out by US B-2 bombers since the 9/11 attacks. Feint said that in order to protect the B-2 bombers, they also used high-speed suppressive firepower. According to him, it was implied that US escort fighter jets also entered Iranian airspace. Feint said that so far, there is no sign that Iran's air defense forces fired a single shot, nor did Iranian fighter jets take off. It also appears that Iran's missile systems did not detect the US aircraft. At the press conference, US Secretary of Defense Hegses specifically mentioned the support provided by ally Israel, and said that these operations had been meticulously planned for several months. When answering reporters' questions, Hegses emphasized that this operation was not aimed at regime change in Iran, but rather to eliminate the threat posed by Iran's nuclear program to US interests, while also ensuring the safety of US troops and America's ally, Israel. The US military carried out this bombing operation with extreme caution, even sending several additional B-2 bombers to the Pacific to mislead outsiders. But in the end, the Iranian air defense forces didn't fire a single shot. So, what exactly is Trump afraid of? I believe he's afraid that the B-2 bombers might be shot down by Iran. Earlier, when Pakistan used Chinese-made J-10C fighter jets to shoot down India's French-made Rafale fighter, it made Trump quite anxious, fearing that the same thing could happen to America's B-2 bombers. 3 days before the US-Iran airstrike, on June 18, Trump held a closed-door meeting at the White House with the visiting Pakistani Army Chief of Staff, General Munir. Because the two men were on completely different levels, General Munir's visit to the US originally did not include a meeting with Trump. But Trump suddenly lowered himself and held a private meeting with a South Asian military officer. It's likely that he wanted to get first-hand information from Munir, to understand how Pakistan used the J-10C fighter jets to shoot down the French-made Rafale, as a reference for the B-2 bombers' attack on Iran. Trump must have confirmed that Iran doesn't have the same Chinese-style air defense system as Pakistan before deciding to send troops to bomb Iran. This brings us back to an old question. In 2008, when China's J-10 fighter jet made its debut at an airshow, Iran and Pakistan were the two most likely foreign buyers. In the end, only Pakistan bought it, Iran did not. At that time, the Iranian military probably looked down on the Chinese-made J-10 fighter jet and were still obsessed with upgrading the American F-14A fighters they had. Just imagine, if today Iran had deployed dozens of J-10C fighter jets, China's HQ-9 medium and long-range air defense missiles, and the Chinese Silk Road I early warning aircraft, whether Trump would even dare to order a B-2 to penetrate Iranian airspace and bomb Iran's nuclear facilities would be a huge question. Iran's own combat capability is weak, and this move ended in failure. And when the US bombs Iran, some anti-China voices online mock the idea of the East rising and the West declining as nothing but a joke. They laugh at China for not being able to help Iran, but the real question is, has Iran even asked China for help? In 2011, China and Iran signed a 25-year strategic cooperation agreement. But in recent years, progress on various projects between China and Iran has fallen short of expectations, for reasons that remain unclear. This raises doubts about whether Iran is truly committed to aligning itself with China. There has always been a faction within Iran that wants to mend ties with the US, but in the end, they end up getting nowhere with either side. Without a strong backer, Iran has become a constant target for Israel and the United States. Iran has taught the world a lesson, showing everyone where it went wrong. Look at the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, 4 of them are at war, and only China isn't fighting. Russia is fighting Ukraine, and the UK and France are supporting Ukraine in the war. The US not only backs Ukraine, but also supports Israel in attacking Gaza, and now it's directly striking Iran. In this chaotic and war-torn international jungle, talking about justice and morality is actually useless. The most important things are strength and survival. Of course, we should condemn the US for its hypocrisy and for violating international law by bombing Iran. But the US doesn't care about other people's condemnation. It goes to war anyway. When a country or region makes mistakes, its chances of survival drop dramatically, especially if it makes too many mistakes. A country cannot afford to make catastrophic mistakes, or it risks being destroyed. Syria is another example. In 2024, the Assad regime, which had ruled Syria for over 40 years, was defeated by the rebel alliance led by the No. 3 Liberation Organization in just 12 days, collapsing rapidly. To escape retribution from the opposition, members of Syria's ruling elite fled to Russia one after another. But life in exile was a stark contrast to the privileged treatment they once enjoyed in Syria. Some even had to work as factory laborers, supporting their families on meager wages. A former Assad regime general, using the pseudonym Uyafu, recounted his harrowing experiences in an interview with Russian media. When he was in Syria, he enjoyed privileges and lived a prosperous life, but after Damascus was seized by the opposition, he fled in haste with his family. Uyafu didn't have time to take his assets with him when he escaped, so now his family of 6 relies on a small amount of savings to get by, and they soon fell into financial hardship. In order to support his family, he now has no choice but to work in a factory in Russia, working 12 hours a day and living the life of an ordinary laborer. Uyafu's experience is not unique. Other Assad generals who have fled to Russia are facing similar difficulties. Although Uyafu was familiar with Russian because he once studied in St. Petersburg, Russia, and obtained his residence permit in advance, which allowed him to find a stable factory job. However, most exiles can only scrape by with odd jobs. These former members of the elite now struggle to survive in a foreign land, and the stark contrast in their status is truly lamentable. The collapse of the Assad regime was not accidental, but rather the result of years of civil war in Syria and the consequence of the regime's corruption. Since 1970, the Assad family has firmly held the reins of power in the country through sectarian alliances and family monopolies. The Assad regime comes from the minority Alawite sect, which makes up about 10 to 20% of Syria's population, yet has long remained at the core of power. Meanwhile, the Sunni population accounts for more than 70% of Syria, but they have been politically and economically suppressed. These sectarian tensions rapidly intensified after the outbreak of the Arab Spring in 2011, eventually evolving into Syria's protracted and expanding civil war. During the civil war, the United States and the European Union imposed harsh economic sanctions on Syria, causing the Syrian economy to collapse. Many military officers maintained a comfortable lifestyle by relying on the gray income brought by their privileges. And the intertwining of this economic hardship and religious conflict ultimately led to the rapid collapse of the Assad regime. Although exiles living in Russia face economic pressures and challenges adapting to society, they are unwilling to leave Syria. If these former generals from the Assad system were to return home, they would likely face retribution, and even their lives could be at risk. By comparison, in Russia, although life is hard and they may go hungry, at least there's a bowl of food to eat. According to United Nations statistics, as of 2024, 6 million Syrians have gone into exile abroad, with Russia being a common destination of choice. However, most of these exiles can only take on low-income jobs at present, earning about $300 to $500 a month. Even at $500, that's less than 4,000 Hong Kong dollars, making life very difficult. But personally, I don't feel any sympathy for Yuyafu's experience. At that time, the regular army of the Assad regime had 150,000 soldiers, plus more than 30,000 reservists. Yet, this force of 150,000 couldn't defeat just a few tens of thousands of rebels from the No. 3 Liberation Organization. And what's even worse is that within just 10 days, the No. 3 Liberation Organization managed to capture the capital. The government troops basically fled at the first sign of trouble. They never really fought seriously. Otherwise, how could the capital have fallen in just 12 days? The corruption and weakness of the government army is obvious. High-ranking officers have now become low-level workers. Serves them right. Who told them to panic and surrender without a fight? This world is brutally harsh. The victor becomes king. The loser is a criminal. If they had known it would come to this, why did they act that way in the first place? If they had known losing the country would be this tragic, why didn't they fight to the death then?